we have organized this webinar with Dr. Nathalie Tocci on the EU global strategy and EU Middle East relations. Now, Dr. Tocci is the director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali. She is a honorary professor at the University of Tübingen and also the special advisor to the EU High Representative Federica Mogherini, on behalf of whom she wrote the European Global Strategy, and she's now working on its implementation, notably in the field of security and defense. Previously, she held research positions at the Center for European Policy Studies, at the Transatlantic Academy, Washington, and the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies in Florence. Her research interests include European foreign policy, conflict resolution, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. She is the author of Framing the EU's Global Strategy, Turkey's European Future, Behind the Scenes of Americans' Influence on EU-Turkey Relations, and the EU and Conflict Resolution. She is co-author of Turkey and the European Union, co-editor of the EU Promoting Regional Integration and Conflict Resolution, as well as multilateralism in the 21st century. In 2008, she also received the Anna Lindh Award for the study of European foreign policy. And this is just a very brief outline of what you have been doing all these years. Nathalie, again, we are very happy and very honored to have you here with us for a EUMENIA webinar. I know how busy your schedule is, so from the bottom of my heart, a big thank you for your willingness to join us. As we have agreed, you can talk to us about the journey of the global strategy as well as where we are at the moment, and touch upon EU Middle East relations for 30 to 40 minutes. And then we can gather questions from this room. And for the rest of the people who join us from anywhere in this world, please write your questions in the chat. Nathalie will be able to see them and respond to them as well. I leave it here. Once again, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Dimitris. It's a pleasure to be virtually with all of you. And indeed, I thought I'd sort of use up this time to run you through a little bit the journey that I think the European Union, and in particular European foreign policy, has been through over the course of the last 5 years, as we come to a close, literally in the coming, hopefully, days of one institutional cycle and a next one to begin to sort of run you through what I think that journey has looked like, particularly from my vantage point, having, if you like, a foot in as well as a foot out of the EU institutional machinery. And indeed, it's been an extremely exciting journey for me, precisely because throughout these 5 years, I have always kept one foot in and one foot out. And what I mean by this is that yes, I have been advising the HRVP. I wrote on her behalf the EU Global Strategy. I negotiated the text. I worked on its implementation, but all the while I have always been a think tanker, with indeed a foot in university life as well. And therefore what I have always tried to do is to carry out my work in the institutions, not as an official, but indeed as a think tanker. So it's precisely that straddling of two worlds that I think has allowed me over the last 5 years to have a particular take on what has been going in, with an eye to what goes on outside as well. So perhaps let me start off by saying that when we began this work 5 years ago, the EU was undergoing, in a sense, a sort of paradigmatic, and let me say almost sort of, I'd say intellectual shift. And it was an intellectual shift that was very much caused by the fact that on the one hand, the world was changing, and it was dramatically changing before our eyes, whereas on the other, the sort of intellectual, political, analytical way of understanding the EU's role in the world had kind of remained stuck back in the 1990s. And I think it's worth recalling that European foreign policy, or what we consider as being European foreign policy, was very much a product. It originated in the 1990s, and the 1990s were a very particular moment in history, not only in the history of the European Union, but in history overall. And what I mean by this is that in the 1990s, it was the end of the Cold War. It was the height of US hegemony in the international system. It was the height of what is now commonly referred to as the international liberal order. And that was an order that was and had been confined within the West, or within the then called free world during the Cold War, and then was extended beyond it, very much in a line of thinking that assumed that precisely because the United States and the West had won the Cold War, that there was a certain inevitability that those norms and standards and rules and regulations would somehow, in different shapes and forms, extend to the rest of the world. And it's not a coincidence that in those years, not only did the European Union, that has ultimately always lived under that broader, if you like, umbrella, sort of security, ideological, economic umbrella that was very much shaped and determined by the United States, carried out and even conceptualized its foreign policy as very much having a purpose, a mission of extending in the EU's own way, which normally have tended to focus more on soft, if you like, policy instruments rather than harder policy instruments, but it was the whole purpose of European foreign policy, be it through instruments and policies that are not foreign policies in the strict sense of the word, like enlargement or neighbourhood policies, but beyond them, you know, the way in which the EU has engaged with regional organisations. The whole point was diffusing the EU's own norms and standards beyond the confines of the European Union itself. And indeed, it was very much the case because there was, as I said, a certain inevitability that this was the way the world was heading. There was no real contestation that this were, these were the goal. This was the gold standard towards others would or should or did indeed aspire to. And it's not as if the EU lived in, as I said, its kind of, little bubble and magic world. It was, and it did look indeed as the case. And if we go back, for instance, to a lot of the academic literature also that was produced in those years, but also throughout the 2000s, the first decade of the new century, the critiques of European foreign policy tended to be critiques that were mainly revolved around the fact that the EU didn't actually do what it said it wanted to do. It was about, yes, we talk about norms and standards and democracy and human rights, but actually what we end up doing is pursuing our energy interests or our migration-related interests or what have you. But there was no real questioning about if you like, perhaps, yes, of the practice, but not of the theory of what is it that the EU did and how it looked at itself in the world. Because indeed, even academics don't live in Mars, they live in planet Earth, and that was the Earth that we belonged to, that we were all part of. And so I think it's important for us as academics, as think tankers, as well as for those that are officials, to have this sense of the context within which inevitably we're embedded in. So we kind of move into the 2010s and we start seeing the way the world changes, and it's changing radically. And it starts changing not only near home, not only as the Arab uprisings turned sour, not only as Russia annexed Crimea and then began destabilizing the Donbass region, not only, as I said, because of things that were happening near home, but also, and it's indeed, this is not disconnected, what started happening inside home as well. So the rise of nationalism, populism before then, the Eurozone crisis, the perception of a migration crisis, whether then it's a reality, of course, it's a different question, but the point is that there has been a perception of a migration crisis. So all of these things started happening, if you like, in that second decade of the 21st century. And so what we ended up having was a real mismatch between, indeed, what the theory said with all its critiques and what the world started looking like. And that world started looking like a world in which actually we couldn't really assume with such ease that everyone simply wanted to look like the European Union, or perhaps even enter the European Union. In fact, there were quite a number of people within the European Union that started having questions themselves about how good idea was it to remain in such a liberal with a small l structure and project. So there started being this contestation both within and outside. And so when we began this work, I guess the main purpose was really that of imagining what a guide, now a strategy can only at best really be a guide, but what a sort of intellectual and political guide could be to try and refit where the EU was, what was the real world that the EU was living in, and indeed what the aspirations were and what the goals ultimately were. So in a sense, the sort of first step in this process was really one of reassessment about how is it that this world was changing. And it really boiled down to a sort of analysis which may sound a bit academic for institutions, but actually it was precisely the analysis that we engaged in within the institutions about the way in which power had started shifting and changing within the international system. And what seemed to be going on, and this was particularly when we were working on the strategic assessment back in 2015, which then ultimately became the analytical basis on which to develop the global strategy, it seemed to us that there were at least a couple of major things that were going on. The first was, in a sense, easier to grasp intellectually. It's very clear that what we have been observing over the years, and perhaps it's become even more obvious in the last couple of years, but I think it was still fairly obvious back in the early 2010s, that we had been shifting away from a global context of US hegemony towards something which may perhaps and there is where the debate lied. What is the kind of system that we're moving towards? Is it a multipolar system? Is it going to be a new bipolar system, a tripolar system, an interpolar system, a non-polar system? So there is obviously a sort of rich, and there has been a rich debate over the direction of travel, but there has not been anyone really contesting the fact that we are moving away from a situation of US hegemony. And naturally, this shift of power from west to east, or from west to we don't quite know where, was not only playing out on a global level, and hence the whole debate about great power rivalry, etc., but also playing out regionally, whether we're talking about Eastern Europe, whether we're talking about the Middle East. So there's a sort of shift of power and an end of US hegemony, which has been something that has been bubbling away for some time. Now, as I said, this is obviously big, but it's intellectually fairly easy to grasp, for the simple reason that it's not the first time that history lives through these shifts of power. Empires over the course of history have risen and fallen, and this is another empire of sorts, which is in its phase of implosion, which I don't mean obviously to say that the United States is imploding, or perhaps it is, but that its empire, quote unquote, meaning its ability and its willingness to sustain an international system that is larger than itself, is obviously on the decline. And in many ways, we can read two very different US presidencies, that of Barack Obama and that of Donald Trump, as being two different expressions of post-imperial presidencies. In the case of Obama, there was obviously a strong attachment to the international liberal order, to the multilateral system, but there was essentially a recognition that the United States no longer had the ability to sustain that system alone, and hence the idea of leading from behind in Libya, the idea of negotiating a UN nuclear deal with Iran so as to sow the seeds of a rebalancing within the Middle East itself. I mean, these were all initiatives that were driven by an appreciation of a United States that could no longer sustain a system on its own. In the case of Donald Trump, obviously, it's a very, very different interpretation of what being post-imperial means. But again, there is something similar there. There is no, in the case of Trump, it's not only that there is not the capability of sustaining that system, there is not the willingness to sustain that system either. And there is instead the willingness and the appreciation of still being the strongest kid on the block, and therefore wanting to extract as much benefit from the system, even if the price to pay is that of breaking the system altogether. So, as I said, this I think is something that has been had already started happening when we started this work, and has simply sort of exacerbated, been accentuated in the last years. But as I said, it's kind of more or less intellectually easy to grasp. The complexity of all this comes in with the fact that we are no longer, and not only, living through a shift of power from something known to something unknown, maybe, or more or less known, but we're also living through an age in which power is diffusing. And what I mean by this is that power no longer simply lies within subjects, actors, whether those actors are states, whether they're international organizations, whether even they are multinational companies. I mean, you know, the debates about globalization back in the 1990s. Because of growing connectivity, we also see the way in which power manifests itself mainly through flows. And those flows are digital flows, they're people flows, they're goods flows, they're services flows, they're all sorts of flows. But it's in those flows and those networks that power really lie. And therefore, many of the global challenges that we're facing, which in my view, you know, they really fall under three big blocks. If you think climate, you think digital, and you think demography. All of those three things are three things that by definition are transnational in nature. All three things lie precisely in flows, in movements, if you like, between and across boundaries. So that was, in a sense, very much the, then also have very specific sort of policy implications. I mean, particularly if we think about the Middle East, which is the region that you're focusing on. Naturally, here I'm mainly thinking about the nexus between climate change and migration as being something which has, or climate change and conflict. I mean, the nexus is there between some of these global challenges, which then have very clear and very real manifestations on the ground. So what did this all mean for Europe? And again, I'm still back to sort of where we were five years ago. First, and probably in many respects most important, what we see, or not most important, I mean equally important, all three. Firstly, given that we're living through a phase of transition, a phase in which one form of an international system is giving way to another, which we don't quite know what it's going to look like, inevitably in these moments of big sort of epochal change, conflicts, crises tend not only to emerge and to exacerbate and to multiply and to spread, etc. And many of these crises, and again, this is something that already in the 2010s became very clear, were indeed within the European Union or in the EU's surrounding regions. The second implication of all this is that because we're living through this phase of an end of US hegemony, there is a growing question mark about the presence and the impact of the United States in our region. When I refer to our region, I'm referring not only obviously to the Union, I'm referring to Eastern Europe, and I'm referring to the Middle East. And in many respects, I think what we're living through now is precisely this massive question mark, which never in the history of the European Union we've really been confronting. It takes a very acute form, particularly if we're thinking about Eastern Europe and our relationship with Russia. It has huge implications if we think about the future of NATO and the implications that also this inevitably has on European defence. And what I mean by this is up until now we have lived, whether we've liked it or not, but we have lived under the US security umbrella. And that's just been a fact of life. And that fact of life had a very basic, let me call it, social contract at its heart. And that social contract said that there was a US security guarantee for Europe. And in return, let me put it this way, in a sort of transactional way, in a contract type of way, Europeans essentially followed the United States on particularly its foreign policy direction. Now, if this meant following on things that we didn't really agree on, let me give the most blatant example, which was the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Yes, we disagreed, but ultimately the social contract held. It was, looking at it not from the level of a particular foreign policy decision in and of itself, but from that broader level of, is it worth actually having US protection and in return having to do a few nasty things? The overall, I'm not talking about my personal view here, but the overall sense was, yes, actually it's worth it. Now, the minute in which one side of that contract no longer holds, as I said, either because of an inability or because of an unwillingness to play that role, perhaps not necessarily today, but if we're thinking in a time perspective of 10, 20, 30 years, then there are massive question marks that inevitably start popping up in one's head. Because if on the one hand you see conflicts, crises, security challenges emerging and perhaps exacerbating all around you, and on the other hand you're sort of left alone, well, there are big questions that have to be addressed there. So there was the whole sort of security and defence aspect, which was very much a debate that started on the one hand as a consequence of the security crises, but at a deeper level on the fact of, and this is why it then sort of over the last year and a half or so, very much took the form about this discussion about European autonomy, because of this idea of, are we alone now? Are we being left alone? Now then, on the other hand, obviously there is, as I said, not only this transition from one system to the other, a reduced role of the United States, but also the emerging of these massive transnational challenges. Transnational challenges, as I said, in the areas of particularly demography, climate and digital, which by definition cannot be effectively tackled by relatively small things like member states. And what I mean by this is that in an age in which we are facing challenges such as these, it is very clear that even the largest member states, even France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Italy, are kind of small fish. That you cannot effectively negotiate with Google if you are, let alone Belgium, but even if you're Germany, that you cannot effectively negotiate with China, or you cannot effectively deal with the challenges of migration or the challenges of climate change unless you have that critical mass of weight, which at a European level you can only hope to achieve at EU level. So all of this created, in a sense, a new rationale, not only for European foreign policy, but as I would argue, actually for the very rationale, for, the very raison d'être of having a European Union in the 21st century today, which is a very different rationale from simply saying we have a European Union so as to overcome war on the continent that had ravaged the continent for centuries. We not only have a European Union to gain greater prosperity because of market integration, we have a European Union because if we want to face these security challenges, because if we want to face to climate change, to digital, to demography related challenges, we need to have that kind of oomph, weight. So all of this to say, so what has been done, and in particular, and perhaps this is slightly more interesting, what perhaps should be done moving forward. So in terms of what has been done, I think it's quite clear that particularly the area of security and defence has been the area in which greatest progress has been achieved, and let me add, far more so than what we imagined even in our wildest dreams. Normally, strategies are not implemented. I mean, this may sound a little bit odd coming from me, but normally strategies are identity building processes. Normally, it is the process of reaching the strategy that is the point of the exercise. And indeed, this is how very much it had started off. It was trying to see, can we get a common narrative that reunites member states on foreign policy, given the divisions over Russia, given the divisions over migration, given the divisions over the Eurozone. And this was really in the same way, by the way, small parenthesis, as the 2003 European security strategy had started off. Even there, it was all about, can we create a common narrative after the split over Iraq? That was why the European security strategy was written. So we didn't really think very deeply, frankly speaking, about implementation. I mean, we did have the ambition that this should be a more operational strategy than the 2003 one. But we could not have imagined that it would have, in some ways, it would have been taken so literally. And I remember a sort of small anecdote back in May probably of this year, when I was working on the sort of midterm review of the global strategy. And we were having a sort of chat with Federica Mogherini about it. And she said, why don't you do something? Why don't because I was like, oh yeah, look at what's written here. Oh, it's actually been done. I didn't even remember that we'd written this. And she said, why don't you ask the officers to do something? Get them to take literally the strategy and almost line by line, especially the operational lines, not the analytical ones. The operational lines, cross-check what was written and what has actually been done. As I guess, I'm not quite sure how many of you in high school did Latin and Greek. I guess Dimitri did. I'm not sure how many others, but in Italian school, in Italian high school, normally the way in which this was done was you kind of had two columns, and you had the version, the Latin or the Greek version, and then you kind of had the translation on the right-hand column. Of sentence by sentence. And so, Federica said to me, why don't we do a sort of Latin version type annex to the report? And actually, we did it in a slightly different form, but it's actually there, to look at what was written and what was actually done. And as I said, it was particularly on, but not only, but particularly on security and defense, it's actually quite striking how things that were in the strategy only mentioned in a vague way. Let me cite the Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, as probably one of the most obvious examples, in which hidden in that text there is a reference to forms of cooperation that could become more structured and permanent over time, something along those lines. So it was kind of a very roundabout way of referring to PESCO. And thinking that only a year and 4 months later it actually happened, is, considering how slow everything is in the European Union, is quite something. And it would not have happened had it not been for precisely the points that I was referring to earlier having become even more obvious after the strategy came out, with Trump, with Brexit, with the sort of rising tensions between the United States and China, with the Middle East continuing to sort of blow up or melt down or implode, or however one wants to put it, because of Russia's not only meddling in Ukraine, but interfering in elections and the fake news. And I mean, because of all these reasons, it had become even more obvious that something had to be done. So that, I would say, is one big block. The second big block, in terms of what has been done, really has to do, and here is where we're getting closer to your neck of the woods, is sort of changing the way we go about our surrounding regions. So no longer having that expectation that everyone simply wants to become like us, and that here we are spreading peace, love and happiness in the world, but the realities are very messy. But how do we deal with these messy realities? Firstly, with an acknowledgement that we don't have, perhaps unlike the United States, the luxury of leaving. And this is something that is becoming increasingly obvious as the United States is, I wouldn't say it's leaving the Middle East, but certainly I think what one can say fairly clearly is that its impact, it's constructive. By constructive, I mean building something, whether what one builds is good or bad, but its constructive impact on the Middle East is zero. In the past, one could debate whether what it constructed was good or bad, so one could have a normative sort of argument about it, but it clearly did construct a lot. Now, what is quite striking is that it is indeed the United States' powerlessness, in my view, in the Middle East. And inevitably, the European Union is kind of left in this world in which it doesn't have an option of going away and going back to the other side of the Atlantic, that it's there, that it's our region, and that what happens in the Middle East is part of our problems, our opportunities, our challenges, and that therefore there is not only a responsibility in an ethical sense of the term, but in a very practical sense of the term, to be there. Now, let's face it, this is a story of lights and shadows. And it's also a story about possible counterfactuals. Let's take a case like Tunisia, for example. I think one could very clearly make the argument about what more could be done. A lot more could be done in Tunisia. And yet at the same time, I think one could also equally make as clear an argument as saying, the European Union is certainly more present than anyone else, and it has been more supportive than anyone else. And what would happen if that support had not been there? As I said, it's a story of counterfactuals. But it is a story of shades of grey. It is not a story of black and white. And one could make this argument, which is a story about sort of resilience building, of trying to work, and this is perhaps slightly more relevant for the sort of North Africa Sahel region than for the Middle East region, trying to use your instruments and policies in a more integrated way. I think in this respect, there has been an important shift, sort of paradigmatic shift in the way in which the EU has approached the region. Moving more to the Middle East sort of neck of the woods, I think that here the main investment, and obviously sort of it will come as no surprise that I'm saying this, has clearly been on Iran. And I think it's worth sort of noting that it was an investment that did not start naturally 5 years ago. It's an investment that started back in Javier Solana's days. But the reason why we have done it or persevered in not only initially negotiating, but then reaching and now defending an Iran nuclear deal, the rationale has slightly changed over time. So when Solana started investing on what eventually became the E3/EU format in negotiations with Iran over its nuclear file, the rationale was very much the same rationale as why he did the European security strategy. You know, after the split over Iraq, what can I do not only to bring France, Germany, the UK back together, but also to recreate a bridge to the United States. So that was the reason why it was done. You know, beyond the sort of naturally specific reasons about why this is important for non-proliferation, why is it important for me? This was the political rationale why he did it. I think if we fast forward to today, the reason why we're defending it, or we're trying to defend it in a way which is inappropriate, inadequate, too little, too this, too that, and too the other. I mean, there are all sorts of ways, and we can perhaps go into this later on, why we can criticize what the EU has done, but we have not walked away. And the reason why we're doing it, and let's take in particular the case of Instex, very much speaks to the points that I was making earlier. I mean, this is a story about Europe's very tortured, slow, difficult understanding of the necessity to become more autonomous. Because today we talk about US secondary sanctions on Iran. But ultimately, what is it that we're saying? What this means is Europeans are being punished for respecting international law, and indeed for respecting an agreement that the United States itself has signed. Now, beyond the moral outrage, which frankly speaking does not get us very far, this signals something which is really quite fundamental, because today we talk about Iran, and it could be, and indeed it is, that European companies that have all sorts of assets in the United States, faced with even if we establish an Instex mechanism to allow for this parallel barter system of trade with Iran, it could be, and it probably is going to mean that the amount of trade that we're talking about is still fairly limited, because ultimately the big companies are not going to stick their necks out for a country which, economically speaking, yes, it may have a few opportunities, but it's simply incomparable to the opportunities that they have, or indeed the investments that they have in the United States. But what if it's not Iran tomorrow? What if, and it's something that could happen not necessarily today, but perhaps tomorrow, the United States decides to impose its sanctions on China and to apply them extraterritorially. Then what do we do? And this is why I'm saying it goes back to this issue of European autonomy. It goes back to how do we understand ourselves in a world in which we are no longer living under this bubble, this system, this umbrella dominated by the United States, in which we are out there on our own. But we're out there on our own without having the instruments to be there on our own. So it's, yes, a big story about defense, but it's about the international role of the euro. It really touches on very, very different issues. Now, I'm realizing I'm probably talking far too much, so let me try and sort of wrap this up. Perhaps with only a final set of things that I wanted to tell you more specifically about the EU and the Middle East, and in particular, thinking about how is it that we could or should be positioning ourselves vis-à-vis what is currently bubbling away, meaning these ideas, proposals for a Middle East architecture. Now, as you know, these are ideas that, for the time being, have been mainly expressed by Iran. So Iran, when was it? 3-4 weeks ago, and I've seen a version of it, although it's not been made publicly available, sort of put out this HOPE initiative. So this initiative that is mainly aimed at security in the Gulf. So it does not comprise the Middle East in toto. Tackling, and I think there are good arguments to say, it's already one big chunk to swallow to try and think about the Gulf, given the way in which the Gulf has very much fragmented, not only in the big confrontation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but with Qatar taking a different position, obviously Turkey having something to do with all this, now the situation in Iraq, the way in which this all plays out in Yemen, the way in which the UAE has been perhaps flipping or hedging from one side to the other. So there's already quite a lot on that plate. Let's focus on Gulf security. Now, these ideas in some respects are not new, For years, in fact, for decades, there have been ideas about an OSCE-like mechanism for the Middle East. I remember back, at some point, it goes back to De Michelis. So this is basically 1990s, the ideas of a CSCM. So a sort of mechanism, OSCE-like mechanism for the Mediterranean. Now, the question is there something different now? I do think that there is something potentially different, largely as a consequence of the fact that balances within the Middle East are shifting. And they're shifting very much in the favor of Iran. Now, one could, looking at it through very realist lenses, one could ask oneself, what incentive does Iran have, given that it's winning, given that its escalation or escalatory moves are actually paying off? Why would it have an incentive to actually engage in a more cooperative and de-escalatory logic for a Middle East architecture? I think that's a legitimate question to ask, but at the same time, it's a fact that the proposals have been coming from Iran, and that there begin to be some little signals, certainly from the UAE, who, as I said, in the last few months have clearly started pursuing more hedging strategy, but also the inklings of a few signs also from Saudi Arabia. Now, it could be that all this ends up in nothing, but let us assume, for the sake of argument, that there is some potential there. And the question is, given everything that I have been saying so far, how is it that we as Europeans should be positioning ourselves with respect to all of this? I think that there are two basic premises to our positioning, and they may sound in contradiction to one another, but I actually don't think they are. The first is a premise that basically says we cannot fix it. Europeans don't have the power to fix the Middle East in general, and not even Gulf security in particular. We have the power to shape, we have perhaps the power to damage, we have the power to do all sorts of things, but we do not have the power to fix it. Now, this obviously doesn't mean to say that therefore we have to shut up on, human rights or a number of other things, but we have to be cognizant that whatever we do, our position is one of a sort of outside-inside stakeholder to this, with only limited influence on what actually ends up happening in. The second, and in a sense diametrically opposite premise, is that I think we do have the right and legitimacy to basically say that whatever happens in this region actually affects us quite fundamentally. And that because it does, we have a stake in it. And so we're not doing it because of altruism. We're not doing it because we think we know best. We don't do it because we think we have the sort of silver bullet to the region. But we do it because what happens in the region touches us in quite fundamental ways, and so we think we have a right to be around that table. Now, I think this mainly has sort of implications with, in a sense, method more than content. I mean, it's clear that the content really does have to come from the regional actors themselves. I don't think it's up to us to basically say, you know, what is it that you should be talking about and with whom and when. I mean, we are essentially not in the role of a promoter, we're in the role of a supporter or of a facilitator. But at the same time, as I said, we do have a stake in what goes on. And so I think that that role as a supporter and as a facilitator should be played in its fullest possible sense. Ultimately, we do remain the only external actor that does have relations with everyone, and it has an experience which is not only its own internal European one, but an experience in terms of other more or less failed attempts at regional cooperation in the broader North Africa and Middle East area. And so, for instance, for the sake of argument, when an Iranian proposal mainly focuses on fairly hardish security questions, we as Europeans may have something to say in terms of why it may also be a good idea to tackle perhaps slightly softer issues, which if we take other sort of regional experiments of this kind, I mean, if we take the 1990 Madrid process, those were arguably the most promising elements, which then very unfortunately were dropped. But there is some experience there and some utility there. So it's that fine line, basically, between, on the one hand, pragmatically understanding where is it that you lie, where you stand, what are interests, and what your potential influence actually is, but at the same time having that clear idea of, you know, what kind of shape of the region is such that caters to what those, you know, what your principles and what your interests are. Now, it's a fine line to walk, but as I said, and here I'll end, we're in this for the long haul. We don't have the luxury of moving back on the other side of an ocean. And the way in which we have to position ourselves with respect to the actors in the region is very much, in my view, a position of basically saying this is our shared region. And because it's our shared region, it is our problem, it is our opportunity, and whether it's a problem or an opportunity, either way, we're not getting away because we've got nowhere to go to. So we're in this together, basically. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Nathalie. Thank you so much for yet another fascinating talk. I think you really took us from the hand and you explained everything, both within the EU, but also system-wise, how things have evolved and where we are today. I myself have a lot of questions, and I think I will use my privilege of being the one kind of monitoring all this conversation. And I will ask two very specific questions before opening up the floor here to the class. And I see that some people have already probably ask their questions in the chat. But first of all, it's the idea of resilience. And I know I know it's very central to the EU global strategy. It has made a lot of us talk a lot about what resilience means, what it doesn't mean. So it has created this very vibrant conversation among academics, think tankers, and practitioners. And because you didn't really tell us a lot about this, I would like, if possible, for you to elaborate a little bit more on what resilience means for you as as the pen holder of this strategy. Secondly, my second question is about a criticism which has come both for the EU global strategy as such, combined with the latest revision of the European neighbourhood policy. And the criticism is that in this effort for the EU to become more pragmatic or more principled, the EU is indeed backtracking. And I know you mentioned that we're not backtracking, even if we wanted, we cannot. But except for Iran, which has become very central, and I think this has been very clear, someone can argue that the EU has backtracked from the Middle East. Syria, for example, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, Yemen, just a couple of examples. I don't think they figure out very prominently in the EU agenda, or that they have figured out prominently in the last couple of years. So I'm just wondering that at the same time, we also mentioned, the US backtracking from the Middle East. And we have all seen what this gap has created and from who it's being filled currently. And this gap is not filled by the EU for sure. I would say that it's filled in by Russia, Turkey, and to a certain extent China as well. So I would like to get your views on all this. I don't know if there are any questions from you. If there are any, can you come a little bit closer so that you're closer to the microphone, or I can just ask the question.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if you could elaborate.
I can't hear very well.
I'll repeat it.
Okay.
That the power is not anchored anymore, but it's closed.
On the flows.
Yeah.
If you could elaborate a little bit more on the flows of power, that's one question.
Yeah. I have a question about
The other question is about the EU's role and how it's connected with this new proposed commissioner position about the European way of life. If realities have changed since this global strategy was written, and whether it will be adapted or adopted based on these new realities since then.
Possibly a bit more generally, I want to know that with the fact that, like you say, we're moving away from American hegemony and in some ways moving to what some analysts have called a G0 world, how do you think that the EU could realistically be, or the member states, be realistically motivated to actually allow the EU to sort of take a more prominent position, rather than, as was often the case, prioritizing member states' preferences, particularly towards the East?
Yeah, and one more question.
Yeah, I want to know a bit more about the opinion on President Macron's recent statement that NATO is brain dead. That seems to correspond with the content of the global strategy, as you have outlined it. But is this the right method politically to kind of get out of the US umbrella and establish autonomy.
Thank you. And one more. Yeah.
Since the global strategy was written, do you think we can act strongly abroad outside of the EU if we cannot be strong at home when it comes, for example, to the migration crisis? If we could be strong enough to uphold that if it happened again?
Did you hear the last one?
I think I got it. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. So let me begin with resilience. I would say that there are three main aspects to this, which, well, I mean, in terms of definition, basically the idea is that in order to achieve all good things, democracy, human rights, economic development, X, Y, Z. So it's not as if resilience replaces those as goals, but it is a supplementary goal because it's a necessary condition. It's considered to be a necessary condition to achieve those goals. The state and the society also needs to be resilient. Now, why and what does it mean? The first aspect is really sort of speaking to, well, I would say one first institutional reason why this was done was that this was a concept that had been already used by and in different policy communities. And in particular, it had been used already for a long time by the humanitarian community, as well as, and this is slightly more recent, by the security community, the humanitarian and development community and the security community. And given that a big part of the purpose of the global strategy was indeed this more joined up, integrated approach to foreign policy, it was about using the HR and the VP hat. I mean, this was the whole background to this, coming from a situation, and this I didn't touch on earlier, in which institutional turf wars had really ripped the Union apart, particularly in the early post-Lisbon period. So the idea that through a concept you could actually get these people to talk to one another and perhaps even work with one another was considered a good idea. Then there was this idea of sort of principle pragmatism that was not intended as saying we have to be pragmatic and therefore we are no longer principled, but in order to be principled in a real sense, and then I'll come back to this when I talk about Syria in a moment. In order to be principled, we have to be pragmatic. So it's a complete flipping of the paradigm, and actually saying we've got to be a slightly less intellectually, and even intellectually, we have to be less intellectually lazy and more politically brave in the way in which we go about some of these things. But then just park that point for a moment. I'll come back to this in a second to give a more concrete example about what I mean. The third aspect is this idea that change is not linear. Again, you know, very much the 1990s was an age that was very much dominated by this idea of linear change, that there is an almost inevitable evolutionary path towards democratization, liberalization, modernization, all these Asians. And the reality is, in the 2010s onwards, that we actually begin to see that there is nothing very linear at all about change, and that it's full of ups and downs. And therefore, if we want to keep that goal of all good things, we have to embed in that process that there will be those ups and downs, and we have to make sure that when the downs come, and there is an inevitability to those downs because change is not linear, that there is an ability to come back on track. So this is very much, if you like, the thinking without it. So again, looking at resilience as, and I think this is a sentence that was put in the midterm review, not as a substitutive goal, but as an additional or supplementative one. Now, let me come back, because this is the more delicate point about this principle pragmatism, and in order to be principled, you actually have to be pragmatic, and perhaps raise precisely the point of Syria that you were mentioning, and the argument of, is the EU taking steps back, particularly from a more norms-based or norm-driven foreign policy, and looking at the case of Syria. Now, I actually, yesterday, I can't remember, day before yesterday, came back from Beirut, where I had 2 extremely intense days of discussions with Syrians from government and opposition. It was mainly a meeting for them and between them, but there were a number of, 4 or 5 Europeans, of which I was the only non-official, really. And the others were basically sort of European diplomats based in the region, responsible for Syria, as you know, with the exception of Norway and Switzerland, and a couple of member states. No other member state is physically present in Syria. They're all based in Beirut, although they do travel to Syria, some on a weekly basis, some on a monthly basis. Anyway, I was actually quite struck by the position, now the principled position, if one wants to, if you like, go down the textbook route, the principled position is that of saying, Bashar al-Assad is bad and ugly and he's slaughtered his own population, and we do not engage with him. We do not interact with him. We do not do anything that would actually grant him any form of legitimacy. And that is a very principled position. Now, it is not a particularly pragmatic position because, as we know, and whether we like it or not, that war has gone in a particular way. And it may be a slightly exaggerated narrative to follow, an Assad-like narrative of saying we won that war, but the truth is not very far from it. Now, you're faced with that reality. What do you do if you really, and you're being intellectually honest and politically brave, want to take a principled position? Do you continue to remain on your high horse? And, I assisted to some really quite striking discussions of Syrians in that room, as much, hear my words, as much opposition as government, of basically saying, please come in and rebuild our schools. And Europeans remaining on their high horse, the diplomats, saying, yes, what do we do? Do we rebuild a school? And then in that school, you end up having Ba'athist propaganda being sold to students. What is the principled position? Now, my view is that, this is my personal political and academic view, is that actually one has to dirty one's hands if you are genuinely interested in having a principled policy. And it's just far too easy, intellectually and politically, to remain on that very black and white position of saying what's good and what's bad. And it's messy, and that reality is messy. And I'm not saying that there is always a clear answer, but what I am saying is that unless you engage yourself in that situation and work in that uncomfortable space of shades of grey, you remain in your comfort zone and you may feel sort of morally okay with yourself, but I'm not sure that from a policy perspective, you're actually being very useful to the world. But as I said, that's a very personal view. On the question of flows and power, I guess what I mean by this is that if one looks at the way in which power is exercised, it is very much in the control of flows. It is very much in the control of movements of data, of movements of people. It is less about, what is it that a particular actor has? What are the resources that it has? What is the military resource, the economic resources, and the way in which those resources are used? Yes, obviously that remains part of the story, but I think it has become a very reductive part of the story about the way in which power plays out in the international system. On the European way of life, now I think there could have been an extremely important way of interpreting this that would have had an institutional implication and a very harmful way of interpreting that also has an institutional implication. I think it would have been an extremely important way of articulating this idea, as indeed an idea that basically says we are in this world in which there is the United States, there is China, there is Russia. All of these are exemplifications of different ways of life. And we have a European way of life, which is not the Russian, which is not the American, which is not the Chinese. But we are part, we do not claim that ours is the only possible model. But at the same time, we defend what we think our model is, and we defend its distinctiveness vis-à-vis other possible models. I think, and again, kind of reflecting the points that I was making earlier, that would have been a narrative in line with this idea of European autonomy, of basically saying, who is it that you are in the world? And it would have had, you know, so that interpretation, you know, sort of having a sort of institutional mirror to it, which was basically ensuring that those referring to that particular vice president of the Commission were all the DGs, or all the sides of the DGs that were really about affirming a European autonomy and distinctness and identity, if you like, in the world. It becomes very, very different, and the interpretation changes quite fundamentally if it is not about who we are in the world, but how do we protect ourselves from people coming in. So had it not been, I would have been a big, big fan of this idea, had it not been, as I said, for the institutional implication that migration would have fallen under this particular vice president. Had there only not been this, but there would have been all the rest, I would have been a big fan of this. But unfortunately, it's not the way it's gone, and it is the way why it has taken so much criticism. On realities, how much have they changed, and do they now imply a change of strategy? As I said, I think that the way in which realities have changed, I mean, obviously things keep on changing in the world, but I think as far as the strategy is concerned, the question that one should ask ourselves is, are the things that have changed the analytical basis upon which you have built a strategy? Are those facts that have taken place been moving things in an opposite direction, in a different direction from the one that you had painted 5 years ago? And I don't think they have. I think that the election, I mean, if we think about things that have happened over the last 5 years, the election of Trump, Brexit, the US pulling out of the nuclear deal, I mean, all of these things, in a sense, have been vindicating, have been providing more empirical basis, if you like, for that analysis. So this is from a more sort of intellectual academic standpoint. From a more political standpoint, there isn't the appetite. No member state today has an appetite to engage in a new strategy building process. And I don't think that for an entity like the European Union, it's actually feasible to engage. I mean, you know, the EU is not a state. So I think that thinking about 13 years, which was the lapse of time that passed between the 2003 strategy and the 2016 strategy, is too much. But I think that 3 years is too little, considering that it takes 2 years to actually do it. So, you know, I think probably in 2, 3, 4 years' time, maybe in a couple of years' time would be the appropriate moment to re-begin the process, which means that probably in 4 years' time from now, there would be a new strategy if there was someone that is as mad as me to engage in a process such as this, which is a question mark. On the Yeah. Our member state wouldn't, what is the incentive for member states to give up, basically, and to allow the EU to have a more sort of independent EU role in the world. Well, two sides to this question. The first is, again, going back to size, do member states actually understand, and I think the answer is increasingly yes, that they cannot do things on their own in the world. And they're unable to effect the change that they would like to see in the world because they are too small. So again, it goes back to this issue of mass and size. And I think there is this growing understanding. I don't think it's a coincidence. Let's take France. I'll come back to France in a moment, but just to sort of lead into the other France point. I don't think that it's a coincidence that when Xi Jinping goes to Paris, what does Macron do? Well, he tries to get over the president of the Commission. He basically tries to provide an EU framing of this, not because he's in love with the EU, but because he knows that if he wants to have the weight to negotiate with China, France is, frankly speaking, fairly small fish. And so he needs to have that EU framing in order to negotiate what he wants to negotiate for France's national interest. I mean, as I said, nothing is done for altruism. So from an interest-based perspective, it's increasingly understood by member states that they need the European Union. Now, this means, and this is the other side to the answer, that one shouldn't, in my view, look at EU foreign policy as being a solo. I mean, this is about being an orchestra. It's about having different instruments and ensuring that these different instruments sing and play in harmony. And I think that still what remains an unfulfilled potential, and I think that Borrell wants to go in this direction, is the idea of using more member states to act in and for the European Union. Now, this requires an empowerment, actually, of member states themselves. So it requires that if a crisis breaks out as it had done over Moldova, you say, hey, member state X, Y, and Z, the council mandates you, so basically a contact group, the council mandates you to act in the name of the EU. Now, this basically means that the member state is all happy, particularly if it's a small to medium-sized member state, because it's acting on behalf of the European Union, but it begins internalizing this. Also in what that member state does elsewhere bilaterally in different contexts. So it's really that of creating ownership of European foreign policy by the member states as well, rather than, I don't want to belittle the idea of empowering EU level institutions, but I think both those things need to take place. Now, on Macron and NATO being brain dead, I would, and I think it was implicit in the way in which the question was posed, and if I'm getting it right, then I would agree with it, that perhaps the analysis is actually correct. I mean, I think, indeed there is a question mark about the essence of NATO, if we are indeed moving in a world in which the United States will no longer be primarily looking after European security, because its big strategic challenge is China, it's not Europe, it's not the Middle East, its resources are relative, and therefore it will increasingly turn elsewhere. Now, NATO without the United States is brain dead. Now, is it appropriate to say it? I think is, as you put it, a question of method, and I would agree that maybe what we should be doing as Europeans, particularly when it comes to defence, is speak less and act more. So we've been talking a lot about autonomy, about European defence, about European armies, about NATO being brain dead, about all sorts of things. Do less talking, a bit more acting, if you want to be taken seriously, first and foremost by yourself. Last point about migration, and to answer the question, let me give you, report to you actually, something that Federica told me very recently, and in which I asked her, if you kind of think back at your last 5 years, which has been the hardest moment for you? And you know, I would have imagined all sorts of different answers, you know, Iran, I mean, literally there's a very long list there. And she said to me, migration. And I said, what do you mean by migration? And she said, in 2015, you just cannot imagine how difficult it was to go to Asia, to Latin America, to Africa, to wherever you went, wherever she went, to talk about all sorts of different things. And the one thing that everyone always said to her is, but what are you doing on migration? What's this fuss that you're creating? How are you handling this? And she was basically like, you know, it became impossible to talk about, you know, to do anything else, because our reputation, our credibility, our image was being so badly tarnished that you couldn't get any business done on anything, you know. So I was quite struck by the way in which, of course, you know, migration was not directly part of her dossier, but in all of her conversations across the world, it was the one thing that people looked at because of the extremely damaging impact it was having on the EU, I mean, in terms of, you know, the image of what the EU is. So in a sense, the bottom line to all this, which goes back and it ties back to this, you know, issue of principle and pragmatism and this and that and the other, is that I think, frankly speaking, talking principles, the best thing that we could possibly do is making sure that we live up to those principles inside the European Union. And then, okay, it doesn't become a piece of cake what we do in the world, but at least we have some sort of standing to try and do something useful in the rest of the world.
Thank you, Nathalie. I think you have some questions in the chat from the people who are joining us from around the world.
So we have one question that says, is the IS, I assume Islamic State, really not constructive anymore in the Middle East? Maybe they're not expanding their presence now. Okay, I get it. In the region, but the military presence in the region is formidable. 45,000 troops in the Gulf alone, and 70,000 in the region as a whole. Then there's a question on JCPOA and on the Islamic State point. I mean, obviously this remains an issue, but to me it remains an issue which goes well beyond the Islamic State, as opposed to Al-Qaeda, as opposed to this, as opposed to the other. I mean, who knows what these things were going to be called in future, but I would reconnect this back to this issue of resilience and state and societal fragility, basically, yeah, which is the flip side of resilience. And inevitably, unless those particular conditions are met, there will always be an Islamic State or empire or whatever, if you like, of sorts. So to me, rather than simply, which doesn't mean to say that you don't have to look at and cure the symptom, of course you need to do it, I mean that's your immediate problem and issue, but it's that deeper conditions that give rise to this in the first place, which I think is, as I said, in that long-term, long-haul game sense that you should be thinking about. On the second question on the JCPOA and Instex, is the EU really doing its utmost by trying to use this mechanism, or is it mainly rhetoric? Isn't Trump's blackmail working very effectively? Now, on Instex, I would say that we underestimated the technical details of getting this up and running. I've looked into this into quite a bit of detail recently. So we certainly underestimated the difficulty in actually doing this. And we oversold it. I think that's that's both fair criticisms. I think that we are and we continue to be genuine about it in terms of actually wanting to get this up and running. And I think in the next few weeks there will be the first transactions. the point is that there is something else that has come into the game, which Europeans themselves, and in particular Macron, brought into the game, which has slightly reduced, I mean, I would say quite significantly reduced Iranian, although they will never admit this, but Iranian incentives to move ahead with Instex. And that's the idea of pre-selling oil to Iran in order to create a credit, if you like, that Iran can use to import goods. And that is a proposal that Macron had suggested in the run-up to UNGA, the UN General Assembly, where, as you will recall, there was the possibility of a meeting between Trump and Rouhani, mediated by Macron. And the big carrot on offer was this idea of pre-selling oil. That hasn't worked. I know the French are still working on this, but it has created, and I don't mean to say that it should not be pursued, but it has had a slowing down effect on Instex in the meantime. And then, of course, yes, Trump's blackmail, but it's not just blackmail. I mean, it's the fact that companies are just are terrified. I mean, they just don't want to go anywhere near all of this. Now, I think there's another element in all this that has actually been quite, actually very damaging. And it has to do with incentives and incentive structures. Now, I was earlier referring to the way in which UAE has been hedging. Well, I'll give you one very concrete example of this. After the Aramco, the attack on the Aramco facilities in Saudi Arabia, UAE has seen very tangibly the capabilities that Iran has if it, damage very significantly, not only obviously, capacities in Saudi Arabia, but therefore would have the capacity to do so in a country like the UAE itself. Only a few days later, 700 million of credit was unfrozen to Iran by the UAE. Now, if you are Iran, what is the bottom line that you get from all this? Unfortunately, the bottom line that you get from all this is that escalation works. Escalation delivers, even if Instex, I mean, even in the best of circumstances, trade through Instex would basically boil down to 30 million per year. An attack on an oil facility magically unfroze 700 million in credit. How do you deal with that? Complicated. So next question, you spoke about hardish security matters. On behalf of Iran, could the EU in any way contribute to HOPE, Rouhani's plan using hardish military means, or will this remain an illusion for a long time to come? As I tried to sort of put it earlier, I think that when it comes to HOPE, and indeed any other regional initiative that comes from the region, I think the EU's role is not really that of putting in chips on that table. I think the chips should be mainly put by the regional actors. It is mainly about helping on the method. And in particular, in this particular case, given that the proposal has come from Iran, trying to use its contacts, particularly with the other Gulf states, to encourage them to respond. And as I said, I think there is something there. There are some threads to be picked up and worked on, rather than putting in and saying, therefore we chip in this, be it on hard or on soft. I think that comes at a later stage. Dear Nathalie, thank you for your talk and your review. Could you please share with us your views on how Brexit negotiations have impacted the external action of the EU in general, more specifically the EAS so far, and how its implementation will affect the global role of the EU and its role in the neighbourhood? So on Brexit, I think that the main cost of this for the EU has already been internalised. And what I mean is that the main cost from Brexit was mainly a cost to the image of the European Union. I mean, this is the first time in the history of the European project in which there's not someone that, there are not people knocking at the door wanting to come in, but there was a member state that wanted to leave. And this was a big blow on image. And I think this is more important than, how fewer military resources as opposed to development resources, as opposed to diplomatic resources, will the EU have. Yes, obviously that is also important, but I think, frankly speaking, it's more limited than what one thinks, for the simple reason that the UK's military resources have never really been put to the service of EU foreign policy. If you just take the contribution of the United Kingdom to CSDP missions and operations, I mean, we're talking about something fairly limited here. In terms of development or diplomacy, one could actually imagine that even post-Brexit, more or less priorities could remain more or less as aligned as they have been up until. So, but the image, the reputational impact was very large. Very large, but although the UK didn't leave the European Union on the 24th of June 2016, that reputational blow took place then. It's been taking place over the last few years. Now I think we're in a very different situation. So I think the world has observed how absolutely dreadful the process of leaving the European Union is, and what is the state of political implosion that it leads to. In the case even of a member state that was as big, as large, as strong, as powerful as the United Kingdom, let alone what would happen to others. So I think actually now that that reputational cost has been internalized, there is and because the EU has actually handled, it's one of the few things that I think is actually quite well, the whole process that actually could have ripped the EU apart, and it didn't. I actually think that we are in a far better place today than we were 3 years ago, and certainly that the UK is in a far worse place than it was three years ago.
Nathalie, once again, a very big thank you for your willingness and to do this, but also for your time to be with us. I know how busy you are, and all of us appreciate it a lot. As I mentioned in the beginning, this webinar is part of the EU Middle East Jean-Monnet network, EUMENIA, and the efforts of the network to reach out to societies, but also provide the opportunity to engage and interact with distinguished speakers, practitioners like yourself. I would also like to thank the Amsterdam Center for European Studies for their support. And you have kicked off the so-called practitioner series of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. A big thanks to everyone who joined us as well virtually. Please make sure that you follow our work on Twitter and on Facebook. And once again, Nathalie, a very, very big thank you to you for being with us.
Thank you.
And wish you all the best with all future endeavors and all the busy agenda as well.
Thank you so much. Best to all of you.